declaration that we are committed to national unity, ending division and to the unity government. We will continue our calls and visits in the region and the world, and we will not abandon our responsibilities. We will go to every place to stop the offensive and to secure our legitimate rights. And we will chase all those who have committed crimes against our people, no matter how long it takes, so these crimes do not go unpunished.
وإنهاء الانقسام وبحكومة الوفاق الوطني
الذي ينفذه جيش العدو الصهيوني.
The Israeli enemy has been hesitant to reveal the actual number of their losses, yet the magnitude of the last operation by Al-Qassam forced them to admit their losses and damages. What the enemy did not admit today is the loss of their own soldier. How can they conceal the disappearance of soldier Shon Arun, tag number 6092065?
They don't even want a two-state solution. They don't want any state solution. Some of them say they should open a great movement and dissolve all the regimes around us. And therefore, in the face of such extremism, in the face of such violence, in the face of such terror, Israel has no option but to defend itself.
Some steps forward, there's still work to be done. But I'm very appreciative that the Secretary General is making great efforts. The UN is wholeheartedly in this effort to try to see if we can advance not just a ceasefire, but a sustainable process going forward.
Hello, you're watching Between the Lines, and I'm Sergeant Preradovic. Well, there are now more than 680 Palestinian civilians killed and over 4,250 others injured as a result of that brutal Israeli attack on the Gaza Strip. The Palestinian resistance, meanwhile, is hitting back. They're claiming to have killed over 50 Israeli soldiers in the last few days alone. Now, all of this is happening as a diplomatic undercurrent involving regional and international powers fails to produce a ceasefire. So, where do we go from here? Well, to discuss that further, I'm joined by a special panel of guests here this evening. In the studio, we have Mr. Issam Naaman. He is the former Lebanese Minister of Education. From the West Bank, we have Mr. Abdullah, the chairman of the Political Committee of Palestinian Legislative Council. Yvonne Ridley is the founder of Viva Palestine and a journalist joining us via Skype from Scotland. And in London, Charles Shoebridge. He is the former UK intelligence officer and a security analyst. A warm welcome to all of you. Mr. Naaman, if I can begin with you here. The fighting on the ground in Gaza is certainly getting more and more intense by the day. Can we expect that civilian death toll that I just read out there to intensify dramatically in the coming days?
Yes, I would think so, because it seems that the Israelis believe that by incurring so many casualties, victims among the Palestinians, that may induce the Palestinian leadership to accept their conditions for a ceasefire. I don't think that the Palestinians will surrender, will go back on their undertakings and their promises, that they will continue fighting till they realize their objectives.
Yeah, and I certainly do want to discuss what the objectives are of this operation from for both sides, actually. But let's talk a little bit more about the humanitarian disaster that we're seeing in Gaza at the moment. Yvonne, if I can bring you in here, it's been revealed that one Palestinian child has been killed approximately every hour since the beginning of this conflict. Yet the United Nations and other international bodies still have this language, very weak language, that it could constitute a war crime. What are your thoughts on that?
Anyone watching the television screens can see exactly what it is. It is war crimes. You know, Israel can't have it both ways. It says it's got all this smart equipment that can target an area with pinpoint accuracy, and yet it targets 4 little boys playing on the beach in Gaza, right in the full view of the international media who were sitting in a hotel nearby watching the drama unfold. They could see there certainly weren't any Hamas fighters. There was nothing untoward happening. 4 children playing football on a beach. It's absolutely shocking.
And Yvonne, it's also, this doesn't get said enough. Gaza was facing a famine before this conflict got underway. How bad is it going to get there?
Well, the children are suffering from high levels of malnutrition and have been for more than a decade. This brutal siege enforced by both Egypt and Israel hasn't been going on for a few years. I sailed in on the first boat which got through the Israeli blockade into Gaza, and we were the first boat to arrive in that port in more than 40 years. This siege has been going on for by air, by land, by sea, for decades. It's brutal, it's unrelenting, and even David Cameron conceded that Gaza is the world's largest open-air prison.
Mr. Abdallah, in the West Bank, the Israelis have been targeting schools, hospitals, water installations, which are very important for the Gaza Strip. Do you think that the part of the strategy here is aimed at putting pressure on the Palestinian resistance or the Palestinian people to force the resistance movement into some sort of a surrender, as Mr. Naaman was mentioning earlier?
Well, definitely the Israeli government set an objective which is high in breaking the unity of the Palestinian people and in subjugating the Palestinians to accept the continued occupation of the Israeli army. Therefore, when they went into their campaign into the West Bank, and then they were faced with the abduction, torturing, and burning alive a young Palestinian child of 15 years old, they shifted to Gaza. They thought that Gaza is an easier target, claiming that Hamas, which has not a very good name in the West especially, but then the people thought that this objective of this Israeli government is against the Palestinian national rights. It's against the existence of the Palestinians as a people. Therefore, the resistance faced from the Israeli side took everybody, young and old, and then the Israelis, because they could not achieve anything of their goals, they directed their rampage against the civilian targets, women and children, as your guest earlier mentioned, the 4 boys playing soccer on the beach. There are other 4 boys feeding their pigeons on the roof of their homes. There are residential areas where the whole family, while eating dinner, they were wiped out. Thus far, we have 41 families that no more in Gaza because being the brutality of the Israelis. And yet, we found some people in the world, like the Prime Minister of United Kingdom or the Chancellor of Germany, who are defending Israel, the new Nazi regime, for its brutality against the Palestinians. They never mentioned the hardships faced by the Palestinians when their water supplies were targeted, their electricity was targeted, their hospitals, their schools, their mosques.
Yeah, mosques and many other installations. We do know of a lot of indiscriminate targeting. Right, Mr. Abdallah, I have to cut you off there because I want to bring Charles Shoebridge into the discussion here, talking about the Israeli objectives in this operation. Mr. Shoebridge, are we jumping to conclusions when we say that they're not achieving anything in Gaza?
Well, first of all, I wasn't able to hear your last contributor, so please forgive me if I'm repeating anything that's already said. But it does appear that to an outside observer that it's difficult to see what objectives are being achieved here. First of all, from a military perspective, rockets are continuing to be fired by Hamas towards Israel. So clearly Israel's stated aim of this operation, for which so many civilians have been killed and maimed, as well as indeed its own soldiers have died in this attempt to stop this rocket fire, has failed. And traditionally, if we look back in history at previous attempts, that has also failed. So really one can see that a political solution, and Israel must know this, is the ultimate way in which to end this situation. But I think it's a fair assumption, looking at the targeting policy of Israel in Gaza so far, that given that some 75 to 78%...
Charles, but is there something different happening? Are we seeing
civilian.
something different this time around? The number of Israeli soldiers that were killed, 20 of them from the Golani elite forces. We have rockets landing next to Ben Gurion International Airport in Tel Aviv, forcing the US and European airliners to suspend flights there. Is this more damage than the Israelis were hoping to sustain?
Well, to continue what I was saying, and I'll bring that into it, that they're not stopping this rocket fire. The rocket fire is continuing to be effective. And of course, because of, for example, the West's policy, or the West policy in this case of certainly stopping air flights, even if temporarily, it proves the way in which relatively inexpensive weapons, such as the weapons that Hamas are using, can have a disproportionate effect by hitting Israel where, of course, it hurts. And that's in the pocket, in terms of its economy. And it may well be that it's by that means that pressure is brought on Israel to actually stop its actions.
Mr. Nauman, what do you think about these losses that are being inflicted on Israel at the moment? Do you think that this current confrontation is going to be a game changer when it comes to the confrontation between Hamas and the Israelis?
True, the Israelis did not expect this violent Palestinian reaction, especially with these rockets covering almost all of Israel, and of that very, very severe resistance to the Israeli army all around the Gaza Strip, everywhere. Of course, the Israelis were not expecting that. And of course, they were not expecting to have this number of casualties. This, I think, will reflect negatively on the Israeli public opinion in the first place, and on the Israeli leadership too. Of course, they would continue pressuring the Palestinians militarily so that the Palestinians will go back on their commitments. But on the other hand, with this perseverance among the Palestinian people, accepting all this Israeli violence and the destruction that they are suffering from, this, I think, will induce the Israeli leadership to accept pressure from the Americans and from the UN in general to accept not an armistice, of course, ceasefire.
Okay, well, speaking of a ceasefire, there have been a number of ceasefires presented to the Palestinians. Yvonne, I want to get your thoughts on that, because do you think that the Israelis, speaking of what the Israelis were and were not expecting, do you think they were expecting the Palestinians to reject those ceasefire offers?
My understanding is that the government in Gaza was not formally told about any ceasefire other than through the media. The proper channels, the correct channels to sit down and broker a ceasefire agreement were not submitted to the Palestinians in Gaza. That is my understanding. But the other thing is that the Israelis have once again seriously underestimated the resistance of the heroic people of Gaza. They did it back in 2008, and Charles mentioned the strategic military aim of the Israeli military. Well, they failed. They failed back in 2008. They had to retreat from Gaza, having taken out maybe 25, 30 Hamas fighters while killing hundreds of civilians. And they didn't dent Hamas. And here history is being repeated, except this time the difference is world opinion is falling very much against Israel, not necessarily from the usual cabal of Western leaders, but I'm talking about ordinary people in the street who have marched collectively in their millions across Europe and across America to campaign against the atrocities that they are seeing unfolding live on their TV screens. So Israel is going to have to sit down with Hamas. The only way you can negotiate a ceasefire is by sitting down with your adversaries, and Israel is going to have to do that. And I don't think Hamas are going to be a pushover. They've paid an enormous blood price, or their people have paid an enormous blood price. And, Palestinian blood might be cheap in Israel, but it isn't in Gaza. And when they sit down and negotiate that ceasefire, I think that it isn't going to be the cakewalk that Israel expects at all.
Mr. Abdullah, one of the aims of this latest Israeli operation certainly appears to have centered on undermining or perhaps destroying that recently formed Palestinian unity government. But it seems to have backfired, doesn't it? Because it seems to have solidified Palestinian unity, not just behind Hamas or one particular political group, but behind the idea of resistance.
Well, listen, this Israeli attack is not against one group. It's against the Palestinian people and their national rights. It's against the very existence of the Palestinians. But they chose to direct their attack against Hamas because they think that will help them around the Western world. When the Israeli missiles come to a building, apartment building, or when they go to the hospital or go to the infrastructure, water or electricity, it doesn't differentiate, it doesn't only seek Hamas member, it seeks the Palestinians. And this is why this campaign consolidated the ranks of the Palestinian people, especially after they formed their national consensus government, which the Israeli government from day one was opposed to that, claiming that it will work hard to break it. And that's what shows the end goal of the Israeli government. This will never happen. As you see, the Palestinian leadership in all its factions, the Palestinian people, whether they're confronting the Israelis in Gaza or in the cities of the West Bank and in Jerusalem. Look, even Jerusalem, that surprised the Israelis because no one Palestinian goes to the Israeli supermarkets. And that is one of the things that they are pointing out, that Israel no more can claim that Jerusalem is united. Jerusalem has its Arab characteristic, has its identity that will never allow, after almost 50 years of occupation, to change its color or its identity. Therefore, it's our salvage is to be standing together and dividing the work among ourselves. One do this, the other do the other thing. But in the final analysis, we have to protect, number one, the lives of our people. This is why we are in keen interest in having a prompt ceasefire. prompt stopping of the carnage by the Israeli military against our people. Second, we have to have the necessary means that makes the life of our people in Gaza bearable or livable. Siege must be lifted. The crossing, all crossings, not one, must be opened, and the availability, the traffic of goods must be also becoming free. The movement of the people must be free. Plus the consolidation of the country together. That the safe passage between Gaza and the West Bank must be effectively functioning. That the settlement in the West Bank must stop, and all aggressive measures must be stopped. And then it's a prelude for an international peace conference where the root cause of the conflict must be visited and a solution must be found based on international.
Okay, Mr. Abdullah, let me get the thoughts of some of our other guests to that. Mr. Naaman, I see you're shaking your head there. I just want to talk a little bit about how much did that solidifying behind the Palestinian resistance force Mahmoud Abbas to perhaps shift his position slightly, because until now, regardless of that unity government, Fatah has been calling for negotiations with the Israelis. Yet yesterday we heard Abu Mazen say that if the Palestinians don't live in peace, then neither would the Israelis.
Yes. At the beginning, Mr. Mahmoud Abbas was blaming a little bit Hamas for these rockets they were throwing on Israel. Though Hamas was doing that as in defense, because the Israelis were the beginners in this respect. But after going to Doha and Cairo and feeling the international situation and the regional situation, and that there is sort of a stand against the Palestinian cause as a whole, he stopped going to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. He went back to Ramallah. He gathered the executive committee of PLO and addressed them and addressed the Palestinian people, in fact, saying that I felt that there is sort of a conspiracy. There is an Israeli campaign to destroy, he said, to destroy the Palestinian cause and to destroy.
Yeah, but that's not really new, is it? Because we've known that all along. The Israelis have been engaged in a campaign.
He is now attacking Israel directly and blaming Israel.
Yeah, so he is slightly shifting his position. Mr. Shoebridge in London, I just want to get your thoughts on some of that there. Do you think, speaking about Palestinian unity, do you think that Abu Mazen and the Fatah and the Palestinian political parties in the West Bank could have done more here to help Hamas in Gaza?
I think they've had to, in many ways, tread a tightrope walk, because on the one hand, they don't want to destroy the negotiation position that might have existed perhaps to get similar aims satisfied as those that Hamas wants in respect of Palestine generally, not just Hamas, not just Gaza, but also in terms of wanting to say in which way this situation went. But I think as time has gone on, and as the sheer scale of the onslaught of Israel on Gaza has become apparent with such a terrible civilian death toll, really it's played Fatah's hand, because it cannot any longer stand on the sidelines, and it was almost inevitable, as Israelis strategic planners must have realized, that this action would drive the two parties, and indeed other parties that form part of the Palestinian government and indeed resistance, it would pull them together. And one wonders whether this in fact is indeed partly an Israeli strategy, because it's so obvious that this would have happened.
Yvonne, do you agree with that? Do you think that the onslaught, the scale of this operation has forced Fatah's hand?
Has forced
has forced Fatah to slightly alter his position when it comes to this recent conflict?
Not entirely, no. I think that right from the first day that Fatah and Hamas announced that they could work together, I think that's when Netanyahu and his government set about trying to undermine and dismantle that, because let's face it, they don't want peace anywhere, least of all breaking out between the PLO, Fatah, Hamas. They don't want to see unity there. Any other sensible government would, because it means you're therefore just negotiating with one person. What does Israel want to do? Sit down with Islamic Jihad? Is that what their intention is? You know, they have to sit down and start negotiating very soon. I do hope that Abu Mazen holds tight. He's had a little bit of a wobble, I fear, which is, you know, he's not Arafat, let's face it. But the unity among the Palestinians is key in what will become ceasefire talks very soon. It is vitally important that the Palestinians remain united and stay together. Unity is key.
Mr. Abdullah, there are those who would say that at times it appears like Abu Mazen is acting like an outside mediator to this conflict. Is Hamas standing alone here?
No, he's not a mediator. Unfortunately, this is the misperception of his movement. Now, we are faced with this aggression by the Israeli army, and unfortunately, the support that we expect is not forthcoming, and therefore, he has to protect the lives of his people. He has to run from one place to another. There are some regional powers that are involved in this, which is not really in our best interest. So he has to try to consolidate, to amalgamate these various opinions and come up with something decent that meets the Palestinian needs, at the same time saves Palestinian lives. We cannot ignore that the regional powers are involved in this conflict, let alone the international powers. Unfortunately, we lost hope. We lost confidence in the international powers because they were watching the Palestinians dying, and they don't think that the Palestinians but of a lesser breed than the rest of the world. When 3 Israelis went missing, the whole world leaders were jumping one after the other in their defense. But when hundreds of Palestinians, kids 3 months old, these are not a threat or rocket launchers against Israel, but their conscience is blunt really and not moving forward. So Abu Mazen, as president of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, he has 2 responsibilities. One, to protect the lives of his people. Second, to stop this carnage and try to gather support from wherever he can get it without aligning ourselves to one axis against another. We have to stay away from the political axes in the region or around the globe. I believe he is doing as Mr. Khalid Mash'al himself said, he was smartly managing this war in a way that is in the best interest of our Palestinian people and protecting our national rights.
Okay, Mr. Shoebridge, Mr. Abdullah mentioned there some of the other regional players involved in this. Do you think there are countries, Egypt for example, that are hoping to use this opportunity perhaps to get rid of Hamas?
Yes, I think to some degree Egypt is working in concert with Israel. I don't think that should be taken as too much of a surprise. After all, if we've only got to look at the genesis of the current regime in Egypt to realize how, shall we say, at odds it is with Hamas, because of course of the traditional relationship that existed between Morsi and Hamas there. So consequently, and indeed Yvonne alluded to something earlier in respect of the ceasefire proposals, whereby, of course, Egypt suggested a ceasefire. This was conveyed to Israel, but not to Hamas, but it was conveyed to the world's media via the West's diplomatic services. And of course, one can see, if one was going to be skeptical, that that whole operation was a way of discrediting Hamas, because on the Western media's headlines said that Hamas was rejecting a ceasefire, which Egypt had proposed, but which of course Hamas knew nothing about. And so I think, and also of course the terms of that ceasefire make no reference to the situation that Gaza finds itself in respect of the mass arrests of Hamas members before this attack actually started, along of course with the ever-present question that needs to be resolved of the siege of Gaza, which of course Egypt has not alluded to, and of course Egypt is participating in.
Yvonne, it seems though that this time around, when we're talking about a ceasefire, it seems that this time around everybody is offering their own version of a ceasefire, doesn't it?
Well, it does. And until somebody actually sits down with all of the Palestinian stakeholders, you can't talk seriously about a ceasefire, because nobody has sat down with the authorities in Gaza and discussed a ceasefire.
Why do you think that is exactly? Do you think that there are different regional players who are working to undermine Hamas, besides the Israelis, obviously?
Well, let's face it, there are those in the Arab world who want to see the end of Hamas because of its links and associations with the Muslim Brotherhood, which has now ridiculously been declared a terrorist organization by Saudi Arabia and Egypt. You know, absolutely ludicrous. There are players in the Arab world who have more interests in the West than actually helping their brothers and sisters in Palestine. And unfortunately, you do have Arab leaders who are looking more like Zionists than Arab leaders. Really, I despair when I look at the lack of unity in the Arab world, which is why, as I said before, it is key that the Palestinians hold tight together and stand by whatever demands that they insist upon, and not allow outsiders to try and influence them, outsiders who have no interest at all in promoting peace in that region.
Mr. Nauman, what are your thoughts on some of that? It seems like this ceasefire, any potential ceasefire agreement this time around, is beginning to mirror geopolitical struggles in the wider region. We have Turkey and Qatar on one side, the Egyptians and the Saudis on the other side. It almost seems like these two sides are sabotaging each other's efforts to end the fighting in Gaza.
Well, of course, what's going on in Gaza is not a Palestinian-Israeli scene only. Of course, so many regional actors, players are subscribing to this what's going on, this war. And of course, every actor, every player has his own interests. And so we have sort of a collision of interests in the region. But still, I still believe that the main player, the main international player is the United States on one hand, and the main regional player is Egypt. And that's what the United States found out from the beginning. The United States asked the Palestinians to accept the Egyptian initiative, they called the Egyptian initiative. The allies of the United States in the region, that's the Saudi Arabia, also asked the Palestinians to accept the Egyptian initiative.
But you heard what some of our guests
on the
said.
other
This is a
hand,
fact. This initiative wasn't even presented to Hamas properly. It was presented through media outlets.
It reached Hamas, the final analysis, but Hamas refused to accept it for the simple reason but that it does not secure any of its basic demands, basic objectives, mainly lifting the blockade and opening all roads to Egypt, at least to Egypt. Still, the United States is playing a very important role and is trying now to modify, to alter a little bit the Egyptian initiative so as Hamas would accept it. We don't know to what extent this trial of this American trial will reach, but it's quite obvious that they are doing something concerning this particular Egyptian initiative.
Okay, Mr. Abdullah, it seems that this time Hamas has decided that it will not settle for just another ceasefire, for just another end to this current round of violence, waiting for the next round to begin. This time, it seems that they have decided to make their last stand, that they will fight until that siege is lifted. Is that indeed the case?
Listen, let me explain about the Egyptian initiative. It is not true that the Egyptian initiative did not reach Hamas. It did, and Hamas leadership, political leadership, for 2 days, and they were saying that they are discussing the initiative. The only part that rejected that initiative right from the beginning is the Qassam Brigade. And this is, there are some reasons. Maybe when Hamas leaders were briefed on the initiative, they did not have the time or did not have the means to reach out to the Qassam brigades. But that is internal thing. It's not that Hamas was ignored. This so-called ceasefire or stopping of the war campaign against the Palestinian people, it's not only a Hamas demand, it's a Palestinian demand. And what President Abbas in his tour of several nations in the past week aimed at consolidating a proposal, an initiative that is more clearer, but it's the same principle. There will be a ceasefire declared within 5 days, the negotiations on the particulars of this ceasefire, how to reach a long-lasting truce. The Egyptian was saying ceasefire within 48 hours, there will be an agreement on the various points to be presented by each side. That's one thing. Now, on the other hand, your question, we don't stop until there is some guarantees. From past agreements, the one in 1909, in 2009, Security Council Resolution 1860, and the one in November 2012, Israel never respected any of the provisions of these agreements. This is why we need two things. We need all the restrictions imposed on Gaza, be it the siege, be it the crossings, be it the fishing range, be it allowing materials and goods to come in for everything, movement of the people, all these things. We have to make sure that there is international guarantee for the implementation of these demands. They are not conditions, in fact, they are living demands. Then comes the political thing which is discussed, but this becomes as a package that was concluded, and our president presented it to the Egyptian side, to the Americans, to Ban Ki-moon, Secretary General of the United Nations, and of course he discussed the details of it with the Politburo chief, Mr. Mash'al, day before yesterday in Qatar. Therefore, what we are presenting now is a Palestinian initiative aims at stopping the Israeli attack promptly, and then moving to agree on easing or lifting all the restrictions imposed on the Gaza Strip. if we can reach an
okay,
understanding
Mr. Abdullah,
on
I have to stop you there. I want to jump over to London and get the thoughts of Mr. Shoebridge on some of that. Mr. Shoebridge, talking about lifting the siege here, we know that the man who holds a key to the Rafah border crossing between Gaza and Egypt is, of course, General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. Now, he's not exactly a fan of Hamas. How likely is it that any ceasefire will entail the lifting of that blockade?
I think there's going to have to be at least an appearance that things have changed. Sisi is susceptible to American pressure, but not as much as Egypt once was. Let's not forget that the key backer now of Egypt has shifted pretty much from the United States to Saudi Arabia. And so Saudi Arabia may see no advantage for itself in benefiting Hamas in any way, benefiting the people of Gaza in any way, and certainly not doing anything to reduce Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But I think in all of this, the United States is the key player. And I say that because we should be under no illusion that without American backing and perhaps European, shall we say, looking away from the scene, turning a blind eye to this, but without American aid, financial and military, within a few days of the United States saying to Israel, stop, even if they said it so diplomatically behind the scenes, Israel would have to stop this offensive. And I think that with this increasing civilian carnage, death toll, and many, many people being maimed, of course, by this offensive, we are getting quite close to the point at which the United States will be indicating to Israel that it will have to stop. And the reason I say this is because, as Yvonne mentioned earlier, there is a lot of opposition from the street amongst people, ordinary people in the West, to what is happening in Gaza at the moment. And what's different now to what was happening in 2008 and 2009 is the explosion in social media, so that the mainstream media in the West, the BBC in Britain and other organizations in the United States, for example, which traditionally have been generally pro-Israel in these matters, are having their credibility challenged by what everybody can find on Twitter and elsewhere on the internet. So they themselves are now being forced to cover in a much more comprehensive way what is actually happening on the ground. And these pictures speak for themselves and are placing pressure on Western politicians to rein Israel in.
Yeah, and those pictures are certainly worse, slightly worse this time around than in previous cases. Yvonne, do you agree with that? Do you think that it's only a matter of time before the U.S. Puts his foot down and says it's now time for a ceasefire?
Well, the U.S. literally gives Israel $3 billion a year. So the US has the influence and the power over Israel. Israel has one God, and that is money. And America has the will to be able to do this. And, Charles is right about all of the social media, the tens and tens of thousands of people who have been demonstrating. And it's not just in the West. Jewish activists actually went outside the Holocaust Museum in Israel, Yad Vashem, and created a bonfire out of a load of baby dolls. There are people within Israel who are disgusted by the military actions on the people of Gaza. And there are Jewish people around the world who are supporting the people of Gaza against this war, who are disgusted by what is being done in their name. So popular public opinion has drowned out the mainstream media, and also the shocking deaths of those 4 boys on Gaza Beach right in the eyes of the watching media has had an impact. And I think that Israel this time has seriously underestimated public opinion, has once again seriously underestimated the resistance of the Palestinian people, and has seriously underestimated the military wiles of Hamas.
Mr. Naaman, do you agree that public opinion in the West, is it going to be enough, this change in public opinion, is it going to be enough to bring about some sort of a ceasefire and perhaps, as you said, a change to the status quo that we've seen in Gaza over the past few years?
Yes, I think the public opinion in the West in general is changing now, maybe slowly, but it is changing. And I would like to say that the United States itself started to change its position. I think that the United States gave the airlines, the airline companies, the impression that it's not secure over Israel, especially at the Ben Gurion airport. And this, I think, is one step in the process of pressuring Israel to change its position. Yes, in the final analysis, the United States will pressure Israel to accept a ceasefire that is not in its interest now. The Israeli government is asking for something that could not be accepted at all by the Palestinians and by the Egyptians, and it seems that the Americans did realize that, and I think they will be pressuring the Israelis in the future, in the coming future, to modify their position and to accept a more balanced ceasefire.
Okay, on that slightly optimistic note, I'm afraid that we have run out of time on this week's edition of the show. I want to thank all of my guests, of course, right here in the studio, Mr. Essam Naaman, former Lebanese Minister of Education. In the West Bank, we were joined by Mr. Abdullah, the chairman of the Political Committee of the Palestinian Legislative Council, Yvonne Ridley, the founder of Viva Palestine and a journalist in Scotland, and of course, Charles Shoebridge, a former UK intelligence officer and security analyst in London. And thank you very much for watching. Don't forget, you can catch us at the same time next week. Goodbye for now.
We assure the nation that we are committed to national unity, ending division and to the unity government. We will continue our calls and visits in the region and the world, and we will not abandon our responsibilities. We will go to every place to stop the offensive and to secure our legitimate rights. And we will chase all those who have committed crimes against our people, no matter how long it takes, so these crimes do not go unpunished.
وإنهاء الانقسام وبحكومة الوفاق الوطني